Oops.
I do love this view.
Yes, beautiful view.
There are ways of approaching this church. It sometimes happens that you come from the other side of the river and then you cross the river at the last second. And as you come up through the river, this all appears very flat. And then out of nowhere, I mean, literally just lifting up above everything else, you see the facade of St. Paul's outside the walls. And if you come in the late afternoon, you see the facade actually catching the light, because as opposed to St. Peter's, which faces towards the east, this one faces west. They actually look at each other across the city, St. Peter's and St. Paul's. So it has a very, very, very striking effect. It's this golden facade sort of in beckoning to the pilgrims coming towards this part of the city. So you left off this morning at Mass with the site where St. Paul was killed, and you saw the three fountains, and you know that the body of St. Paul was brought back down the Via Ostiense, and it was laid to rest in the property of a very wealthy woman and her family, as was not uncommon. And so this burial ground, this site became the burial ground of St. Paul. We have it attested to in the 2nd century AD that people are coming to visit this trophy on the Viale Ostiense, which is the site of Paul's burial, as well as pilgrims who are coming to see the tomb of St. Peter, obviously on the Vatican Hill. And when Constantine legalized Christianity, he began building the first 6 Christian churches. And when we go to St. Paul, St. John Lateran, we'll be seeing really the non plus ultra of the early Christian churches, the first legally built Christian church in the world. But that church, St. John Lateran, has been altered many times. And this one actually looks much closer to the building that Constantine built, even though this is the most recent of all the churches. The structure we're going to visit today was built in 1823 and completed in 1854. The events leading up to that I will get to in a minute. So here we are in the tomb of St. Paul, a relatively small church in the beginning. When Constantine built his first churches, he favored the Lateran Church. He also favored St. Peter's Church, and he put up a relatively small shrine on the site of Peter's tomb that faced in the opposite direction. The change will come when the 5th century takes place, and there are so many heresies. One of the things that I find kind of ironic about the legalization of Christianity is that the minute it was legal to be Christian, people came out of the woodwork to explain Christianity, and they usually were coming up with something not right. So this is the era when we get Arius, this is the era we get the Nestorian heresy, this is the era when we get heresy after heresy after heresy. And who's the go-to guy for the defender of the faith but St. Paul? And so the 4 emperors in that period will make a decision to rebuild Paul's church. They will reorient it in this direction so it faces St. Peter across the street. The 2 of them will become like the new twins of Rome. I'm going to get back to that soon. It became the largest church in the world when the 4 emperors, Honorius, Theodosius, Galla Placidia was a woman involved. When they rebuilt this building, it was the largest church in the world. It was considered the most beautiful church in the world. And on top of everything else, to get from the walls of the city out to this church, there was a 1-mile-long covered portico. So there was a steady stream of pilgrims coming, whether it was rain or shine. They were always protected and also always welcomed back and forth. The church was added to, it was embellished over the course of the years. But tragedy struck in July of 1823 when they were doing work on the wooden traves in the ceiling of the building. The workmen left embers on those traves, and they during the night they caught fire. And the church burnt down in the space of a night, essentially. Pius VII was dying that night, and after a lifetime of pontificate of dealing with Napoleon, they didn't have the heart to tell him. So he died unbeknownst to him that this ancient and important church had just burnt to the ground. And the fact of the matter is that the next Pope, Gregory XVI, faces a very, very difficult problem, which is rebuilding this church in the 19th century. The 19th century, it's the beginning of the great secular age. It's almost like we're almost gone full circle back to the pagan era. Half of the time people are looking to get rid of the church. Is who needs the church? This breakup with the French Revolution, the secularization of Europe. They have to come up with a ridiculous amount of money to redo this church. Where's it going to come from? Gregory XVI did not lose hope, and he was right not to. Donations came in from all over the world, from Catholics but also non-Catholics, and from Christians and also non-Christians. Everybody contributed. This great sense of unifying, which Paul's lifetime was, it's repeated in the story of the rebuilding of this church. So 30 scant years after the destruction of this church, they inaugurated or reconsecrated on December 10th of 1854, and here we have the new church. It opens with an atrium, an idea of a space that comes between your getting out of your busy life and entering into the space of prayer. The placement of Paul's tomb is very interesting. We have the river that way, and we have a main consular road on the opposite side. We have the river here, we have the Viale Ostiense on the other side, and what a perfect placement for a man who wrote so many letters that traveled by land and by air, a man who traveled so much by land and by land and by sea, by land and by sea, by land and by sea. And so, what a perfect placement. The idea behind the idea behind the atrium is particularly lovely. It has these palm trees, which obviously they wouldn't have originally had, but it adds to this idea of a new Jerusalem. It's like a preview of the rest of your trip, but it's also a sense of preparation for that peace that we're looking for. I mean, grant us peace. The church is going to be a lot slicker, and most of the columns are machine made, so it doesn't have that kind of aged. That aged feel to it, but nonetheless, it's splendid to see something in sort of glorious, luminous form. And there he is, standing at the entryway, our St. Paul, holding a sword, not only instrument of his martyrdom, but also instrument of his defense. That those sharp writings, that sharp defense of the faith. That again, the reason why the church was built the way it was built. Now I see that there's a very exciting movement towards the center. Is there something exciting happening inside, like the entire world is in